What would you do if the life you'd built for 50 years was sold out from under you by your own blood? For 68-year-old Ruth Hadley, this wasn't a question. In the spring of 1887, her children sold the family farm in the Kansas flatlands for a handful of silver to fund their new lives in the city, leaving their widowed mother with nothing but the collapsing old barn. But the truth waiting inside that derelict structure, a truth welded in iron and sealed by a husband's love, was about to change everything. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from, as we tell a story of forgotten promises and the quiet strength of a woman left behind. The dust from her son's departing wagon had settled on the road a full week before Ruth Hadley allowed herself to truly feel the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a prairie evening, the kind she had shared with her husband, Thomas, on their porch for nearly half a century. This was a hollow, ringing silence, the sound of absence. Her farmhouse now belonged to a stranger named Silas Croft. She could see its windows from where she stood, blank and unfamiliar, reflecting a sky the color of a bruised plum. Her children, Mary and John, were gone. They had come back to the farm after Thomas's passing, not to comfort her, but to liquidate. They had called it settling the estate. To Ruth, it felt like they were burying her alongside their father, just a little more slowly. They were good children, she tried to tell herself, just practical. The city had filled their heads with notions of progress, of cash in hand being worth more than soil underfoot. They didn't see the value in the sweat-stained legacy their father had carved out of the unforgiving prairie. They saw only acres and dollars. And they had taken the dollars. They had left her the barn. It was meant as a kindness, they'd said. A place to keep her old mare, Bess, and the few belongings she'd insisted on keeping. A place to live, John had suggested, his eyes not quite meeting hers. Until you figure things out. What they meant was, they were leaving her the one thing on the property deemed utterly worthless, an unsellable liability. The barn was a behemoth, a relic from a more ambitious time. Thomas had built it with his own hands, felling the cottonwoods, squaring the beams, and, in his blacksmith's forge, crafting every hinge, latch, and iron support himself. It had been the heart of the farm, a cathedral of labor. Now, it sagged. Its roof was a patchwork of hope and missing shingles. The wind sang a mournful tune through the gaps in its siding. To her children, and to the new owner, it was a ruin. To Ruth, it was all she had left of him. She stood before its great groaning doors, the leather of Bess's lead rope worn smooth in her calloused hand. The mare shifted her weight, her warm breath misting in the cool air, a patient, silent witness to her mistress's grief. Ruth's gaze traveled up the leaning walls to the high, gabled peak. She remembered Thomas up there, a silhouette against the setting sun, hammering the last ridge cap into place. He had turned, seen her watching from the house, and waved. A small, private gesture that had felt like the whole world. The memory was so sharp it was a physical pain, a stitch in her side. She had lost her husband, her home, and her children in the space of a single turning season. All that remained was this decaying monument to a life that was. Taking a slow, ragged breath that tasted of dust and dry grass, she slid the heavy bar on the barn door. It protested with a screech of rusted iron, a sound like a long-held scream. The cavernous dark within smelled of old hay, earth, and memory. "Well, Bess," she murmured, her voice raspy from disuse. "Looks like we're home." The barn was a patient kind of dying. Each day, it seemed to settle a little deeper into the earth, sighing dust from its ancient bones. Sunlight pierced the roof in 100 places, creating a shifting constellation of light on the hay-strewn floor. When it rained, the interior became a percussive symphony of drips, each one finding a different surface, a tin bucket, a wooden trough, a puddle on the packed dirt, to play its note upon. Ruth had made her small corner in the old tack room, a space barely larger than a pantry, walled off from the main expanse. It was dry, at least, and had a small pot-bellied stove that Thomas had installed for warming newborn calves. She had her cot, a trunk of clothes, and a single kerosene lamp. Its steady golden glow was a small anchor against the overwhelming dark of the barn at night. Her days fell into a simple, quiet rhythm, dictated by the needs of her old mare and the slow, arduous work of making her corner habitable. One afternoon, as she was leading Bess back from the creek, a rider approached. It was Silas Croft, the new owner of her life's work. He was a man who seemed to take up more space than he was entitled to, broad and loud, with a new saddle that creaked with importance. He reined in his horse, a young, spirited gelding that danced nervously, a stark contrast to Bess's placid stillness. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hadley," Croft boomed, not waiting for a reply. He gestured with his chin toward the barn. "Still standing, I see. Surprised a good wind hasn't put it out of its misery." Ruth said nothing. She just held Bess's lead and met his gaze. Her silence seemed to unnerve him more than any argument would have. He shifted in his saddle. "Look," he said, his tone softening with a false sort of pity. "I know your children mentioned you'd be staying here for a bit, but it ain't safe. Place is a tinderbox. An eyesore, to be frank." He reached into his coat. "I'll give you $20 for the lumber. My men can tear it down in a day. Save you the trouble. Put a little something in your pocket." $20. For the structure that had taken her husband 2 years of relentless labor to build. For the shelter that had seen them through blizzards and droughts. For the last tangible piece of her history. The insult was so profound, it barely registered as emotion. It was just a fact, like the hardness of the ground beneath her worn boots. "No, thank you, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice quiet but firm as stone. "The barn is mine." He stared at her, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. He laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. "Have it your way, old woman. Don't come crying to me when it falls on your head." He spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled over her like a shroud. Ruth watched him go, her hand stroking Bess's graying muzzle. She felt not anger, but a strange, deep-rooted certainty. They all saw a ruin, her children, this loud man, the whole world. But as she stood in its long, cool shadow, she could almost feel Thomas's presence, a quiet insistence in the air. This place wasn't dead, it was just waiting. What makes a person cling to a ruin? Why choose a collapsing shelter over the promise of a safe, new place? Was it stubbornness, or was it something more? A quiet faith in what no one else can see. What do you think was going through Ruth's mind as she stood there, defying the man who owned everything around her? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us to look closer. Now back to the barn and the secrets held within its walls. The town of Prairie Ridge was small, and gossip traveled faster than a dust devil in August. It took less than a day for Silas Croft's version of the encounter to make its way through the general store, the saloon, and the sewing circle. The old widow Hadley, the whispers went, gone touched in the head, living in that wreck of a barn like a hermit, refused a fair offer for it, prideful. When Ruth made her weekly trip to the store for flour and salt, the conversations would hush. People would nod at her, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity in their eyes. They saw a ghost, a relic of a past the town was eager to leave behind for the promise of the railroad and new money. Croft, for his part, made a show of his magnanimity and her madness, tried to help the poor woman, he'd declare to anyone who would listen in the saloon. Offered her cash money. But you can't help folks who won't help themselves. She's just sitting in there, waiting for it to fall down. He was building a new modern farmhouse, all milled lumber and glass windows, and he liked to point out the contrast between his progress and her decay. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Ruth was patching a section of wall with salvaged planks, a stooped figure approached across the field. It was Esther Mayhew, a woman even older than Ruth, who had been the town's midwife for 40 years and had helped bring both of Ruth's children into the world. Her face was a roadmap of a long life, her eyes clear and dark as well water. She didn't stop at a polite distance but came right up to the barn, her gnarled hand reaching out to rest on a sun-bleached timber. She said nothing for a long time, simply breathing in the scent of old wood and earth. Ruth stopped her hammering, waiting. Esther's visits were rare and always purposeful. Finally, the old woman turned her gaze from the barn to Ruth. She looked at Ruth's hands, strong and capable, still holding the hammer. She looked at her face, etched with grief but resolute. "Some things hold more than just hay," Esther said, her voice a dry rustle like corn husks. She looked up at the massive, complex structure of beams and supports that held the loft. A good man's hands remember their work. That was all. She gave Ruth a short, sharp nod, as if confirming something to herself, then turned and walked away with the same slow, deliberate pace she had arrived with. Ruth stood, the hammer heavy in her hand, watching the old woman recede into the tall grass. The words echoed in the quiet air. A good man's hands remember their work. It wasn't a warning, not exactly. It wasn't pity. It felt like something else, a key offered without a lock. She looked at the wall she was mending, at the way the new board fit against the old. She looked at her own hands, chapped and sore, but still able. The town's mockery was a distant hum, like flies buzzing on a hot day. Croft's contempt was the wind, loud and then gone. But Esther's words settled deep inside her. A single solid stone dropped into the well of her loneliness. She didn't fully understand them, not yet, but she felt their weight. That evening, as the sun set and filled the barn's interior with shafts of dusty gold, Ruth lit her lamp in the tack room. The world outside had written her off, had dismissed her and her crumbling inheritance as a sad final chapter. But here, inside the walls, her husband had built, surrounded by the echoes of his labor. A different story was beginning to feel possible. She picked up a splintered board, feeling its grain. She would not wait for it to fall, she would hold it up. The decision to truly inhabit the barn, not just exist in its corner, was not made in a single moment. It was a slow turning, like a sunflower following the light. It began with the first cold snap of October, when the wind found every crack and whistled a tune of coming winter. Ruth knew she could not survive in the tack room alone if a real blizzard hit. The small stove was a comfort, but it was no match for the vast, uninsulated space that surrounded her small sanctuary. That first night, a hard frost fell, silvering the dead grass and coating the barn roof in a glittering skin. Lying on her cot, wrapped in every blanket she owned, Ruth listened to the building settle and groan. It sounded like a great beast shifting in its sleep. The timbers contracted with the cold, letting out sharp reports like pistol shots in the dark. A loose piece of tin on the roof rattled a frantic, lonely rhythm. She thought of the warm, solid farmhouse, of the deep hearth and the thick walls, and a wave of despair so profound it was almost physical washed over her. It would have been so easy to give in, to take Croft's pitiful money, and find a small room to rent in town, to fade away as everyone expected. But then she heard Bess stamp her hoof in the nearby stall, a solid, living sound in the echoing dark. The old mare blew out a soft breath, a sound of simple, animal contentment. Bess wasn't despairing. She was just there, present, trusting in the shelter, however imperfect. A wave of shame followed the despair. Thomas had built this place to be a fortress of self-reliance. He had trusted its strength. Was she, his wife, to be the one who declared it a failure? The next morning she awoke with a new resolve. She would not be a guest in this barn. She would be its steward. Her first task was to move Bess to a more sheltered stall, deeper within the barn's core, away from the draftiest north wall. She spent the entire day clearing it out, shoveling away years of compacted, rotted straw. The work was brutal, back-breaking. Her muscles, accustomed to the gentler labors of a farmhouse, screamed in protest. But with every shovelful, she felt a shift. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances. She was shaping them. As she worked, she began to see the barn not as a single, decaying entity, but as a system. She saw how the rainwater that dripped from one spot on the roof was channeled by a sagging beam to another, hastening the rot. She saw how the prevailing winds had pushed one wall almost 2 inches off its foundation. She started to learn the language of the barn's decline. She spent hours just walking its perimeter, inside and out, her hand trailing along the walls, her eyes tracing the lines of the rafters high above. The place was a map of her husband's mind. She could see, where he had used a particularly fine piece of oak for a load-bearing joint, and where he had made do with lesser pine for a simple partition. It was an intimate, silent conversation with a man long gone. One evening, as dusk settled, she climbed the rickety ladder to the main hayloft, a place she hadn't been in years. The air up there was thick and still, smelling sweetly of dust and time. She stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the gloom. The whole of the farm spread out below through a missing section of wall. She saw the lights of Croft's new house flicker on, a stark yellow square in the deepening blue of twilight. She felt a pang of loss, sharp and sudden. Then she turned her back on the view and looked into the heart of the barn. It was here in the high, cathedral-like quiet of the loft that she would begin. The loft was a sea of forgotten time. Decades of chaff, dust, and the nesting material of birds and mice had formed a thick, soft carpet over the floorboards. Ruth found an old, stiff broom and began to sweep, starting in one corner and working her way out. It was less like cleaning and more like an archaeological dig. With each stroke of the broom, she uncovered another layer of the past. A broken tool handle, a small leather baby shoe, its purpose up here a complete mystery. The skeletal remains of an owl, its wings still faintly outlined in feathers. The work was methodical, rhythmic. Sweep, gather, push the pile of debris toward the open hay door to be shoveled out later. Her world shrank to the small circle of her labor. The town, her children, Croft, they all faded away, replaced by the simple, satisfying task at hand. Her mind grew quiet, focused only on the scrape of the broom and the feel of the wooden floor beneath her feet. High above her, the skeleton of the roof was a complex web of trusses and beams, all hewn and fitted by Thomas. His work was everywhere. It was late afternoon when she reached the central part of the loft. The sun, now low in the west, sent a single, brilliant shaft of light through a gap in the western wall, illuminating the dust motes like a galaxy of tiny stars. The beam of light fell directly across one of the massive iron support straps that Thomas had forged to reinforce the main crossbeam. He had been proud of these straps, one of the first blacksmiths in the county to use forged iron for structural support in a barn this size, rather than just wood. Most of the straps were rough, pitted with the marks of the hammer, and coated in a fine layer of rust. But as her broom passed over this one, in the heart of the sunbeam, something was different. She stopped. The broom fell from her hand. She knelt down, her old knees protesting. Where the light hit the iron, it wasn't a dull, rusty brown. It was smooth, almost polished. She ran her fingers over it. The rest of the strap was coarse, but a section about a foot long felt slick and cool, with a strange, almost seamless finish. It didn't make sense. Why would a man as practical as Thomas spend hours polishing a structural support in the middle of a dark hayloft where no one would ever see it? She looked closer, her face inches from the metal. There, at the edge of the smooth section, was a nearly invisible line. A seam so perfectly fitted it was almost imperceptible. And next to it, stamped into the iron, was her husband's maker's mark, the double H for Hadley. But this one was different. Next to the H was a tiny, five-pointed star. She remembered that star. He had used it only a handful of times, on the things he considered his finest work. The iron gate for the churchyard, the weather vane for their own roof, the tiny latch for the jewelry box. He'd made her for their 25th anniversary. It was his mark for a secret pride, a piece of work that held a part of his soul. Why was it here, on a hidden beam in a dusty loft? The question hung in the air, as tangible as the dancing dust. She didn't have an answer. She just knelt there in the fading light, her hand resting on the cool, smooth iron, a seed of wonder planting itself in the fertile ground of her grief. Something was here. Something was wrong. Or maybe, for the first time in a long time, something was exactly right. The discovery of the marked beam changed the nature of Ruth's labor. Before, she had been working for survival, a battle against decay. Now, she was working with purpose, driven by a quiet, insistent curiosity. She finished sweeping the loft, her eyes continually drawn back to the strange, smooth section of iron. The anomaly was a burr in her mind, a detail that refused to fit the picture of her practical, no-nonsense husband. She didn't speak of it to anyone. The secret, if there was one, felt too fragile, too personal. It was a silent conversation between her and Thomas, carried on across the veil of years. She began to spend more time in the loft, ostensibly to organize the stacks of old lumber, but really to be near the beam. She would sit on a nearby pile of hay and just look at it, trying to understand. She remembered Thomas at his forge. The memory came back in fragments. The rhythmic clang of the hammer, the hiss of hot metal in the quenching tub, the fierce glow of the coals that lit his face from below, making him look like a creature of myth. He had been a quiet man in all other aspects of his life, but at his anvil he was an artist. He spoke the language of iron and fire. Her investigation became physical. She started paying closer attention to the barn's construction, not as a whole, but in its smallest details. She ran her hands over the joinery, noting the perfect fit of the mortise and tenon joints. She studied the pattern of the hand-wrought nails. She was learning her husband again through the work of his hands. A good man's hands remember their work. Esther's words came back to her again and again. One day her resolve hardened. Simple observation was no longer enough. She brought a small mallet and a rag with her to the loft. She polished the smooth section of the beam, rubbing away the last fine layer of dust. The metal beneath was a dark, lustrous gunmetal gray, utterly unlike the rusted surfaces around it. It looked new. She took the mallet and tapped the beam, first on the rough, solid part. It produced a dull, solid thunk. Then, her heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest, she tapped the smooth section. The sound was completely different. It was a clear, ringing tone, with a distinct hollow resonance, bong. It was the sound of a container, a void, a secret, a thrill sharp and unfamiliar shot through her. It was not the fear of a lonely widow, but the excitement of a detective on the verge of a discovery. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that Thomas had put something here. He had hidden it, and he had marked it for her. He must have known she would be the only one who would recognize the significance of the small star, the only one who would look closely enough to see the seam. This wasn't just a hidden object. It was a message. It was a test of her memory, of her attention, of her faith in him. For whom else could it be? Their children had never once set foot in the forge, had never cared for the details of their father's craft. They saw a barn. She was beginning to see a treasure map. She descended the ladder, her mind racing, how to open it. The seam was too fine for a crowbar. That would only damage it. This required not brute force, but a blacksmith's touch, a surgeon's precision. She went to the old, dusty forge in the corner of the barn, a place she hadn't touched since his death. His tools hung on the wall, exactly as he had left them. She reached out and took down a set of his finest chisels and a heavy, weighted hammer. The tools felt right in her hands, an extension of his will. She was no smith, but she had watched him for 50 years. She had learned by watching. She was his apprentice at last. The work was slow and agonizing. Perched precariously on a stack of hay bales she had arranged as a makeshift platform, Ruth held the fine-tipped chisel against the invisible seam. Her hands, though strong from a life of farm work, trembled with a combination of age and anticipation. The first strike of the hammer against the chisel produced a spark and a sharp crack that echoed in the cavernous quiet. A tiny flake of metal chipped away. It was a start. For 3 days she worked. Her world shrank to that single foot of iron. Tap, tap, chip, tap, tap, chip. The rhythm was her prayer. Her shoulders ached, her back screamed, and her hands were raw and blistered. At night, she would fall onto her cot, too exhausted to eat, and sleep a dreamless, heavy sleep, only to rise by dawn and climb the ladder again. She was fueled by a potent mixture of grief and hope. With every chip of metal, she felt closer to him. She was undoing his last, most secret piece of work, and in doing so, she felt as if she were having one final conversation with her husband. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, something changed. The chisel, which had been meeting with solid resistance, suddenly sank a 1/4 of an inch deeper. A longer, cleaner crack appeared along the seam. She stopped, her breath held tight in her chest. She put down her tools and pressed on the section with her thumbs. It moved. With a low groan of metal on metal, a small, perfectly fitted plate of iron, about 1 foot long and 6 inches high, swung inward on a hidden hinge. It revealed a dark, rectangular cavity within the larger iron strap. Her lamp, placed on a nearby beam, cast a flickering light into the space. There, nestled securely inside, was a heavy iron box welded shut. It was smaller than a loaf of bread, but felt impossibly dense. Tears she didn't know she was holding back began to stream down her face, dripping onto the dusty floorboards. They were not tears of sadness, but of profound, overwhelming vindication. He had not abandoned her. He had known. He had prepared. Using the edge of the chisel, she managed to hook the box and slide it out. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it down the ladder, cradling it like a newborn, and set it on a workbench in the light of the tack room door. The lid was welded at the corners. She took the hammer and a heavy cold chisel and, with a few sharp, well-aimed blows, broke the welds. The lid came free with a last metallic sigh. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks of coins. Not silver, gold. Double eagles gleaming in the lantern light as if they were minted that very morning. A king's ransom. Beneath the coins was a folded document, its paper thick and heavy, sealed with wax. She carefully broke the seal and unfolded it. At the top, in ornate script, were the words, United States Land Patent. It was the original deed to all 160 acres of the Hadley farm, granted to Thomas Hadley Sr., her Thomas's father, and passed to him. It was the one true title, the root of ownership. Tucked inside its folds was a single sheet of paper, covered in her husband's familiar, blocky script. Her hands shaking, she read the letter he had left for her. "My dearest Ruth," it began. "If you are reading this, then the world has become what I feared, and our children have forgotten where they come from. But I knew you would not forget. I knew you would see my mark. This gold is for your comfort, but the patent is for your strength. The land is yours, Ruth. It was always yours. I built this barn to protect our future. I am trusting you to protect its past. Yours forever, Thomas." She sank onto a stool, the letter clutched in her hand, the gold glowing on the bench beside her. The barn was not a ruin. It was an ark. And her husband hadn't just left her a building. He had left her a kingdom. The sky had been a strange, bruised yellow all day. The air was thick and heavy, unnaturally still. The birds were silent. Ruth, her mind still reeling from the discovery, felt the change in the atmosphere. She knew this weather. It was the herald of a storm, the kind of violent tantrum the plains threw when the seasons turned. She spent the afternoon securing the barn as best she could. Her newfound wealth and legal power momentarily forgotten in the face of the immediate physical threat. She wedged boards into the gaps in the walls, checked the tethers on the main doors, and moved Bess into the most central, protected stall, giving her extra hay and speaking to her in low, calming tones. The first gust of wind hit just after dusk, a physical blow that made the entire structure shudder. Rain followed, not in drops, but in solid sheets thrown sideways by the gale. The roar was deafening. The roof, her patched and precarious roof, became a drum, the drips inside turning from a symphony to a chaotic cacophony. For the first time, a flicker of real fear touched her. What if Croft was right? What if the barn couldn't take it? What if she had found her salvation only to have it torn away by the indifferent fury of nature? Sometime near midnight, above the howl of the wind, she heard another sound, a desperate shouting. She unbarred the small tack room door and peered into the maelstrom of the main barn. A fist was pounding on the large southern doors. "Hello, is anyone in there? Please, help us." Ruth grabbed her lantern, its light a small, brave circle against the immense, roaring dark. Fighting the wind that tried to rip the door from her grasp, she managed to slide the heavy crossbar and heave one side open. A man stumbled in, soaked to the skin, his face pale with fear. Behind him, a woman clutched a bundled infant, while a small boy of about 5 peered out from behind her skirts. Their wagon, a dark, crippled shape in the flashes of lightning, had a broken wheel and was sinking into the mud of the lane. "Our axle snapped," the man gasped, shouting to be heard. "We saw your light. Any shelter will do." Without a second's hesitation, Ruth waved them in quickly. "Bring your horse. There is room." The man, whose name was David, looked around at the leaking roof and the groaning timbers with a doubtful eye. But the ferocity of the storm left him no choice. He led their exhausted horse inside, while Ruth guided his wife, Sarah, and their children toward the relative dryness of the tack room. She gave them her only blankets and stirred the embers in the small stove, adding more wood until a welcome warmth began to push back the cold. The storm worsened. Sound like a freight train passed overhead, and the entire barn seemed to lift and then slam back down. The little boy screamed and buried his face in his mother's dress. David, the traveler, looked at Ruth, his eyes wide. That was a twister. It passed right over. But the barn had held. Its deep-set foundations and the massive interlocking frame Thomas had built had stood fast. At the height of the storm, a section of the new, flimsy roof on Silas Croft's distant farmhouse was torn away. They could see the frantic flickering of his lamps when the lightning flashed. But inside the old barn, the drips continued their rhythm. The wind howled outside, and the 5 of them, plus 2 horses, were safe. Ruth moved through the chaos with a calm authority. She showed David where the strongest beams were, how the structure was designed to flex rather than break. She used her knowledge, gleaned from her days of patient observation, to reassure him. This wasn't a collapsing ruin. It was a ship designed for heavy seas, and she was its captain. She was no longer a pitiable old woman. She was a protector. She was sheltering a family, proving the worth of what the world had dismissed. The barn and Ruth herself were being tested by fire and water, and they were holding. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving a scrubbed, clean world in its wake. The air was cool and calm. Puddles in the barn floor reflected the first pale light of morning. The young family, exhausted but safe, slept in the tack room. Ruth stood at the open barn door, looking out at the aftermath. The lane was a river of mud, and downed branches littered the fields. In the distance, she could see a gaping hole in Silas Croft's roof. Her barn, however, stood tall. It was battered, leaking, and scarred, but it was whole. Its great gray silhouette was a testament to endurance. The family she had sheltered, the Millers, were full of a quiet, profound gratitude. As David worked to repair his wagon wheel, using tools Ruth provided from Thomas's forge, his wife Sarah helped Ruth prepare a simple breakfast of coffee and biscuits over the pot-bellied stove. "We thought we were done for," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "When we saw your light, you and this barn, you saved us, Mrs. Hadley." When the Millers finally left late that morning, their wagon mended, they didn't just disappear, They stopped in Prairie Ridge to buy supplies, and they told their story. They spoke of the terrifying storm and of the old woman in the dilapidated barn who had given them sanctuary when they were certain they would perish. They didn't describe a mad hermit. They described a calm, capable matriarch and a structure that, for all its appearances, was as strong as a fortress. The story created a ripple. It ran counter to the narrative Croft had so carefully constructed. Later that week, a buggy pulled up to the barn. It was not Croft, it was a man in a town suit, a lawyer from a larger county seat named Mr. Abernathy. He had been in Prairie Ridge handling an estate and had heard the miller's remarkable tale in the general store. Curiosity, he said, had gotten the better of him. He was polite, his eyes taking in the scale of the barn with professional appreciation. "They say this old place saved a family," he said, his tone neutral. Ruth simply nodded. "My husband was a good builder." After a moment of quiet consideration, she made a decision. She invited him into the tack room, offered him a cup of coffee, and laid the original land patent on the small, cluttered table between them. Mr. Abernathy picked it up carefully, almost reverently. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the formal script, his fingers tracing the embossed seal. He was silent for a very long time. He read it once, then read it again. He looked from the document to Ruth and back again. A slow look of astonishment, followed by deep respect, dawned on his face. "Mrs. Hadley," he said, his voice low and serious, "do you understand what this is?" "It is my husband's land," she replied simply. "It is more than that," the lawyer said, a small smile playing on his lips. "This is the root title. All subsequent deeds and transfers, they are merely branches. Without the surrender of this document, no sale is truly and legally complete. The deed your children signed with Mr. Croft," he paused, choosing his words, "is a promise to sell. It is not, in the eyes of the federal government and the land office, final conveyance of ownership, not without this patent." He looked at her, his professional demeanor giving way to genuine admiration. "Mrs. Hadley, according to this, the finest legal document in the land, this farm is still yours. It has never, not for one moment, stopped being yours." The townspeople, who had once whispered, began to find reasons to ride out past the Hadley place. They saw the mended walls, the slowly improving roofline. They saw the quiet, steady work. Silas Croft, upon being served a politely worded letter from Mr. Abernathy, was first apoplectic, then silent. His bluster and contempt were useless against the quiet, unassailable power of that piece of paper. He had been humbled not by force or by anger, but by a truth that had been waiting patiently in the dark. The chorus of mockery had faded, replaced by a murmur of awe. The old woman in the barn was not a fool. She was a queen, unknowingly presiding over her kingdom all along. The seasons turned. The settlement, as Mr. Abernathy had called it, was quiet and swift. There was no grand court battle. Faced with the undeniable primacy of the patent, Silas Croft had no choice. He could not force Ruth off her land. The lawyer had presented him with two options. He could vacate the property entirely, losing the money he had paid the children and the investment in his half-built house, or he could purchase the 150 acres surrounding the barn at the proper market value, with the funds going directly and solely to Ruth Hadley. The 10 acres encompassing the barn, the lane, and the creek access would be hers, free and clear forever. He chose the latter. The shame of being outmaneuvered by an old woman in a falling-down barn was less than the shame of returning to the city empty-handed. He paid, and he never bothered Ruth again. The gold coins remained in the iron box, secret between Ruth and the memory of her husband. The money from Croft was more than enough. It was security. It was independence. It was the quiet vindication of a life's labor. Ruth did not leave the barn. She hired a pair of young, strong brothers from a neighboring farm to help her with the heavy work she could no longer do alone. They replaced the roof, shoring it up with new timbers but following Thomas's original design. They reset the wall that had leaned, sinking its foundation deep into the prairie soil. They replaced the rotted siding, board by board. They worked under her watchful eye, and she paid them well. The townspeople watched the law transformation. The barn was no longer a symbol of decay, but of resurrection. It stood straight and proud against the Kansas sky, its new roof tight, its walls solid. It was still old, still weathered, but it was no longer dying. It was alive, breathing, cared for. One evening, at the end of a long summer, Ruth stood at the great open doors as the sun began to set. The world was washed in a warm, golden light. The air was soft, filled with the scent of cut hay and clean earth. Her old mare Bess ambled up beside her and rested her heavy head on Ruth's shoulder, a familiar, comforting weight. Ruth looked out across the fields at the solid fence line, the secure roof, the order she had restored. She ran her hand along the massive doorframe, feeling the texture of the wood her husband had shaped. She had not only saved his work, she had completed it. She had honored the trust he had placed in her. A profound peace settled over her, a quiet apotheosis at the end of a long journey. She had faced loss, mockery, and the fury of the elements, and she had endured. She had found more than gold or a piece of paper. She had found the enduring strength of a love that builds, a love that provides, a love that trusts across the silence of death itself. She leaned against the ancient wood, her silent companion beside her, and whispered into the golden air, "He didn't just build a barn. He built a promise." Thank you for joining us for this story of enduring love and hidden strength. If you were moved by Ruth's journey, please let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of quiet courage and unexpected discoveries. We'll see you next time.